The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Ryan Carter sat alone on a worn wooden bench in Liberty Park. The golden hues of October painted the world around him, leaves crunching underfoot, a cool breeze stirring the branches above. Around him, life moved on. Elderly couples strolled along winding paths, their conversations a gentle hum in the background. Children's laughter rang through the air as they chased each other across the grass, their tiny feet kicking up piles of amber and crimson leaves. The distant sound of a street performer's violin added a melancholic undertone to the scene, a soft melody weaving through the late afternoon air. But Ryan barely noticed any of it. His gaze was distant, his thoughts miles away, lost in memories he could never quite escape. The war had left its mark on him, not just in the form of the scars hidden beneath his jacket, but in the weight he carried deep within his chest. Some wounds never healed, and some ghosts refused to stay buried. He had seen things that would haunt him forever. Brothers in arms taken too soon, missions that had gone horribly wrong, and the silent sacrifices made in the name of duty. With a slow exhale, he leaned forward, rubbing his hands together to chase away the chill in his fingers. He had come to the park seeking solace, a brief respite from the restless nights and the emptiness that often followed him like a shadow. But peace was fleeting, and fate had a way of finding him even in the most unexpected places. As he absent-mindedly watched the people passing by, his gaze landed on a figure near the edge of the park, where the benches were more secluded, tucked beneath the sprawling limbs of an ancient oak tree. There, hunched over with his coat pulled tightly around him, sat an elderly man, his face lined with years of hardship. His clothes were ragged, his shoes worn through at the soles. A small tin cup sat beside him, a few scattered coins clinking against its metal surface whenever a passerby tossed in spare change. But it wasn't the man that made Ryan sit up straighter, his pulse suddenly hammering in his ears. It was the creature curled up at the man's feet, a dog, barely more than skin and bone, its once strong frame reduced to a fragile shell of what it had once been. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His mind struggled to process what his heart already knew. The matted fur, the slumped posture, the ribs pressing against its thin coat like they were trying to break free. But most of all, it was the eyes. Those familiar amber eyes, dulled now with exhaustion and hardship, but still unmistakable. Axel. Ryan's world tilted as he stared at the dog, his chest tightening with a mixture of disbelief and dread. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Axel had been his partner, his lifeline in the field, a K-9 who had saved his life more times than he could count. They had trained together, fought together, and survived together. When Ryan had been wounded during an ambush, it was Axel who had stayed by his side, refusing to leave him even as bullets rained down around them. And when the war ended, when Ryan had been discharged and returned home, he had been told that Axel was being retired from service, that he was being placed in a good home, adopted by a family who would care for him in his final years. And yet, here he was, forgotten, abandoned. A sickening wave of anger and guilt surged through Ryan as he slowly rose from the bench, his legs moving on their own accord. He closed the distance between them, every step feeling heavier than the last. The dog didn't move at first, too weak to react, too tired to lift its head. But then, as if sensing something familiar, Axel's ears twitched. His tired eyes flickered upward, landing on Ryan. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ryan swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Axel. The dog's body tensed slightly, recognition flickering behind those weary eyes. His tail, weak as it was, gave the faintest thump against the pavement. That was all it took. Ryan dropped to his knees beside him, his hands hovering, hesitant, afraid to touch, afraid to confirm the worst. His breath came shallow, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had a soldier, a hero, been reduced to this? Before he could reach for Axel, a voice cut through the moment. "What do you want with him?" Ryan's head snapped up to see the old man staring at him, his grip tightening on the makeshift leash tied loosely around Axel's neck. His tone was defensive, protective even, but beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of uncertainty, of wariness. Ryan forced himself to take a breath, to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He met the man's gaze, his voice firm but controlled. "He's mine," he said, the weight of those words settling between them like a challenge. "His name is Axel, and he used to serve with me." The old man's expression hardened, his fingers tightening around the leash. "No," he said. "He's been with me for months. I found him on the streets when no one else would. I took care of him when no one else did." Ryan clenched his jaw, frustration and disbelief warring within him. How could this have happened? How could a dog like Axel, who had given everything, who had stood by his side in the worst of times, be left to fend for himself, scrounging for scraps and sleeping on cold pavement? "You don't understand," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's not just a stray, he's a soldier, and someone threw him away like he was nothing." The old man hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. There was doubt in his eyes now, a crack in the wall he had put up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "Tell me your story." Ryan exhaled, his heart still racing as he turned his gaze back to Axel. This wasn't just about reclaiming a lost partner. It was about uncovering the truth and making sure that justice, real justice, would be served. Ryan dropped to his knees, his breath catching in his throat as he reached out toward Axel. His fingers hovered inches above the dog's frail body, hesitating, afraid to touch, afraid to confirm just how weak and broken his old partner had become. Axel's amber eyes blinked slowly, unfocused, as if he was trying to place a memory just beyond his reach. His ears twitched at the sound of his name, but he didn't move. There was no excited bark, no eager tail wag, just the faintest, most exhausted flicker of recognition. It was enough to make Ryan's chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. Before he could go any further, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "What do you want with him?" Ryan's head snapped up. The old man, the one who had been sitting beside Axel, had stepped forward, his expression hardened with suspicion. His weathered hands gripped the makeshift leash, a frayed rope knotted loosely around Axel's neck, as if he expected Ryan to try and rip the dog away from him. His stance was defensive, protective even, and there was a roughness in his tone that warned Ryan he wasn't going to back down easily. Ryan straightened, keeping his hands at his sides, trying to steady his voice. "I know this dog," he said carefully. "His name is Axel. He served with me overseas." The old man scoffed, shaking his head. "Not anymore, he doesn't," he said. "He's been with me for months. I found him starving in an alleyway, barely able to stand. No one else cared about him. No one else wanted him." His grip on the leash tightened. "But I did." Ryan swallowed, forcing himself to remain calm. He could see the conviction in the man's eyes, the deep-rooted belief that Axel had been abandoned, discarded by a world that no longer found him useful. And in a way, the old man wasn't wrong. Someone had failed Axel. Someone had left him behind, but that someone wasn't Ryan. "You don't understand," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Axel isn't just some stray. He's a soldier, a hero." His fists clenched at his sides, and someone threw him away like garbage. The old man, Frank, as Ryan would later learn, let out a low, humorless laugh. "A soldier?" he repeated, shaking his head. "Maybe once, but look at him now." His expression softened just slightly as he glanced down at Axel, who still hadn't moved, His body curled tightly as if bracing against the cold. "He's not some war hero anymore. He's just a dog who was left behind." Ryan's jaw tightened. "He wasn't supposed to be left behind," he said. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Then where the hell were you?" The words hit Ryan like a blow to the chest. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because what could he say? That he'd tried? That he'd fought to keep Axel? That he'd signed the paperwork, made the calls, trusted the system to do right by his partner? That he had been told Axel was being placed in a good home? That he had believed, naively, foolishly, that Axel was safe? But none of that had mattered. Somewhere along the line, Axel had slipped through the cracks. Somewhere along the line, someone had decided that he wasn't worth keeping. And now, Ryan was staring at the consequences of that failure. "I didn't know," he admitted finally, his voice quieter now. "I was told he was going to a family, that he was going to be cared for." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I never would have let this happen if I'd known." Frank studied him for a long moment, his sharp gaze searching, as if trying to measure the truth in Ryan's words. Ryan took a step closer, his voice more urgent now. "Please, he deserves better than this." Frank's expression hardened again. "And you think yanking him away from me is what's best?" Ryan hesitated. "I just want to take care of him," he said. "I want to give him the life he should have had." Frank's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what if I say no?" Ryan stared at him, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to have to fight for Axel like this. But looking at Frank now, he saw something he hadn't before. The old man wasn't just being difficult. He wasn't just trying to keep something that didn't belong to him. He cared. For months, when no one else had been there, Frank had looked after Axel. He had fed him, sheltered him, given him whatever scraps of kindness he could manage. And even if he wasn't willing to admit it outright, Ryan could see it in the way Frank stood between them, the way he held that leash like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to something real. Ryan let out a slow breath. "Then at least let me tell you who he is," he said. "Let me tell you what he's done." Frank hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Axel once more. The dog let out a quiet whimper, shifting slightly against the cold pavement, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on him as well. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Frank sighed. His shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him just a little. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to tell me his story? Go ahead." Ryan nodded, dropping back down to his knees beside Axel. He reached out this time, his fingers brushing gently against the dog's fur. It was rough, unkempt, tangled with dirt, but beneath it, he could still feel the faintest tremor of warmth, the faintest echo of the strong, fearless partner he had once known. And as he began to speak, telling the story of who Axel had been, who he still was, Ryan knew that this wasn't just about reclaiming a lost partner. It was about proving that Axel had never truly been forgotten, that no matter what had happened, no matter how much time had passed, he was still worth fighting for. Ryan took a slow breath, steadying himself as he reached out, resting a gentle hand on Axel's frail body. The dog didn't flinch, didn't pull away. That was something. He could feel the subtle rise and fall of his breath beneath his palm, weak but steady. The Axel he remembered had been a powerhouse, alert, strong, fearless. The sight of him now, reduced to skin and bone, was almost too much to bear. Frank stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his weathered face etched with doubt. He had agreed to listen, but Ryan could tell he was still skeptical. The old man had been the one caring for Axel when no one else had. And now some stranger had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to know the dog's past. It was clear Frank needed more than words. He needed the truth. Ryan exhaled slowly before he spoke. It was Afghanistan, he began, his voice quieter now, thick with memories he had tried for so long to suppress. A routine mission. At least that's what we thought. We were sweeping through a small village, checking for enemy activity. The intel said it was abandoned, but I should have known better. Something felt off. Axel felt it too. He paused, looking down at the dog, remembering how sharp Axel had always been. He hadn't just been trained to detect explosives, he had instincts that ran deeper than training, instincts that had saved Ryan's life that day. We were moving down a narrow alley when Axel stopped dead in his tracks. His ears went up, his whole body tensed. That was all I needed. I called for the team to stop. Ryan swallowed, remembering how the weight of his rifle had suddenly felt heavier, how the air had been thick with something unseen. That's when I saw it. The tripwire, barely visible, stretched across the path ahead. If we had taken one more step, we wouldn't be standing here right now. Frank remained silent, his gaze flickering between Ryan and Axel. Axel saved us, Ryan continued, his voice growing more resolute. But the insurgents knew we were there. The moment we stopped, the ambush hit. Gunfire erupted from every direction, explosions shaking the ground. We scrambled for cover, but I wasn't fast enough. A blast threw me back, knocked the wind out of me. I couldn't move. He clenched his jaw, remembering the disorienting ring in his ears, the searing pain in his side. I thought that was it. I thought I was done. Ryan looked down at Axel again, giving the dog a small, pained smile. But he wouldn't let me die. Even injured, Axel had stayed at his side, dragging him behind cover while bullets rained down around them. He had held his ground, guarding Ryan with a fierce determination until reinforcements arrived. It had been Axel's bravery, his unshakable loyalty, that had gotten them both out alive. Frank shifted his stance, clearing his throat, but when he spoke, there was something softer in his voice. If he's so important to you, he said carefully, then why wasn't he with you when you came home? Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He had known the question was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. I tried, he admitted, his fingers tightening against Axel's fur. Before I left the service, I filed for adoption. I did everything by the book, filled out every damn form. I wanted to take him home with me. But I was told he had already been placed with a family. Frank frowned. And you didn't check? Ryan exhaled sharply, the frustration and guilt bubbling to the surface. I did. I pushed for details, but all they gave me was a name, some civilian adoption program. They told me he was safe. That was all I wanted to hear. He shook his head. I trusted them. I trusted the system to take care of him the way he deserved. His fingers brushed against Axel's collar, and that's when he felt it. A rough edge, something torn. Carefully, he turned it over and caught sight of a metal tag, partially ripped, the engraving worn, but still visible. Ryan's stomach dropped. He recognized the number. It wasn't from any civilian adoption program. It was military-issued. He narrowed his eyes, carefully tracing the edges where the tag had been forcibly removed, not naturally worn down. Someone had tried to erase Axel's past. Someone had deliberately made sure he wouldn't be found. Frank must have seen the change in Ryan's expression. What is it? Ryan looked up, his heart pounding. Something's not right, he said, gripping the tag. They told me he was adopted by a family, but this... He lifted the collar slightly. This doesn't make sense. Why would they remove part of his ID? Why would they make it harder to track him? Frank's gaze darkened with something Ryan couldn't quite place. Suspicion. A flicker of understanding. You think someone dumped him on purpose, Frank said. It wasn't a question. Ryan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. He looked down at Axel, at the dog who had saved him once, who had been left to suffer when he should have been given the peaceful retirement he earned. This wasn't just about a mistake. This wasn't just negligence. Someone had wanted Axel to disappear, and Ryan wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. The towering glass structure of Sentinel Defense Group stood like a fortress against the gray sky. From the outside, it looked like just another corporate building, sleek, modern, professional. But Ryan knew better. Beneath its polished facade, Sentinel was responsible for handling retired K-9, the very program that was supposed to ensure these dogs found proper homes. And yet Axel had ended up starving on the streets. Ryan tightened his grip on the worn collar in his hand, the torn identification tag pressing into his palm. This wasn't just negligence, this was something far worse. Someone had deliberately erased Axel from the system. As he walked through the front doors, he was met with the sterile scent of air conditioning and freshly polished floors. A receptionist glanced up, offering a rehearsed smile. "I'm here to see Marcus Doyle," Ryan said, his voice even but firm. The woman hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" Ryan pulled out his military ID and set it on the desk. "Tell him it's about a former K-9 under his care, Axel." Her expression flickered with something, uncertainty, maybe recognition, but she simply nodded and picked up the phone. A hushed conversation followed, and then, after a pause, she gestured toward a hallway. "He'll see you now." Ryan didn't wait for an escort. His boots echoed down the pristine marble floor as he made his way toward the office at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar when he reached it, and inside, behind a massive mahogany desk, sat Marcus Doyle. The man barely looked up as Ryan stepped in, too busy reviewing something on his computer screen. His suit was crisp, his demeanor controlled, but there was something in his eyes, something cold, calculating. "Sergeant Carter," Marcus finally said, leaning back in his chair as he studied Ryan. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ryan didn't bother sitting. He reached into his pocket and tossed Axel's collar onto the desk. The small metal tag clattered against the polished wood. "Explain this," Ryan said, his voice sharp. "Axel was supposed to be placed in a home. Instead, I found him half dead in an alleyway." Marcus barely glanced at the collar before sighing. He folded his hands in front of him, his expression unreadable. "And?" Ryan clenched his fists. "And? That dog served with me. He saved lives. He was promised a future. Instead, you dumped him like trash." Marcus exhaled slowly, as if this conversation bored him. "Look, Sergeant Carter, I don't know what you expect me to say. These dogs, they serve their purpose. But not all of them are suitable for adoption." Ryan's jaw tightened. "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus finally met his gaze, tilting his head slightly. "You think every retired K-9 gets a happy ending? A warm house, a loving family? That's not reality." His voice was calm, almost condescending. "Some of them are too aggressive. Some are too old. Some have medical issues that make them too expensive to keep. The ones that meet adoption criteria, sure, we place them. The rest," he shrugged, "they don't all make it." Ryan felt something cold settle in his chest. "So you throw them away?" "We make decisions based on resources," Marcus corrected, his tone devoid of emotion. "Axel was not deemed viable for adoption. He was removed from the system." Ryan took a step closer, his voice low but laced with anger. "Removed? You mean erased? His tag was torn off. His records were wiped. You didn't just reject him, you made sure no one could find him." For the first time, Marcus's expression flickered, just for a second. A brief slip of composure. "You're making accusations without proof," he said smoothly. Ryan stared at him, realization settling in. This wasn't just an oversight. This was policy. "How many?" Ryan asked, his voice quieter now, but far more dangerous. "How many dogs like Axel have you removed?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ryan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "These dogs gave everything. They stood beside us in war zones, saved lives, protected people like you. And you're telling me that the moment they stop being useful, they're disposable." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "They're dogs, Sergeant. Tools. When a weapon gets too worn to function, you don't keep it around for sentimental reasons." Ryan's hands curled into fists. "They're not weapons. They're soldiers." Marcus smirked, shaking his head. "And yet no one fought for them. Not until now." Ryan's stomach twisted with guilt. He had trusted the system, believed that Axel had been taken care of. He hadn't fought hard enough. But that ended today. Straightening, he grabbed the collar from the desk, his fingers closing around it like a promise. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady. Marcus simply smiled. "It never is." Ryan turned on his heel and walked out, his pulse hammering. He had come here for answers, and in some twisted way, he had found them. But the truth was worse than he had imagined. Axel hadn't slipped through the cracks. He had been erased. And now, Ryan was going to make damn sure the world knew it. The evening air was crisp as Ryan stepped out of his truck, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on his shoulders. The confrontation with Marcus Doyle had left him seething, but it had also solidified his resolve. Axel had been discarded, erased from the system like he never existed. But Ryan wasn't about to let that stand. The fight for justice was only beginning. But first, he had to do right by his partner. He made his way back through Liberty Park, retracing his steps from earlier that day. The golden hues of autumn had faded into a dusky twilight, the last remnants of daylight clinging to the edges of the sky. Lampposts flickered on, casting pools of soft yellow light across the pavement. The park, which had been bustling with life hours ago, had grown quieter. Near the same weathered bench, beneath the same old oak tree, Frank Bennett sat with Axel curled at his feet. The old man looked up as Ryan approached, his expression unreadable beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. "You're back," Frank said, though there was no surprise in his voice. Ryan nodded, his gaze dropping to Axel. The dog was curled up tightly, his breathing slow, his body still frail but just a little less tense than before. Axel had recognized him, even in his weakest state. That meant something. It meant everything. "I'm taking him home," Ryan said, keeping his voice steady, though he could feel the emotion thickening in his throat. Frank's grip on the makeshift leash tightened ever so slightly. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was hesitation. The old man's weathered fingers ran along the coarse rope like he was trying to memorize the feeling of it. "He's not just a dog to you, is he?" Ryan asked softly. Frank let out a quiet breath, his shoulders sagging. "No," he admitted. His gaze drifted down to Axel, and for the first time, Ryan saw something more than just an old man trying to protect a stray. He saw a man who had lost something, maybe many things, and had found solace in the quiet companionship of a dog who had also been left behind. "I didn't know where he came from," Frank continued. "Didn't know what he'd been through. But when I found him, he was alone. Just like me." Ryan swallowed hard. He had come here expecting resistance, but instead he found understanding. He had spent so much time thinking about Axel's suffering, about how his best friend had been abandoned, that he hadn't stopped to consider what Axel might have meant to Frank. "I don't doubt that you saved him," Ryan said honestly, "that you gave him a place to rest when he had nowhere else to go. But Frank, he's not meant for this life. He deserves better." Frank nodded slowly, his fingers still gripping the rope, but now more gently. "So do a lot of us," he murmured. Silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. Ryan could feel the weight of Frank's choice pressing down on him. The old man had spent months with Axel, caring for him in the only way he knew how. Letting him go wasn't easy. Then a quiet sound broke the stillness, a soft, weary shuffle of paws against pavement. Axel moved. It was slow, deliberate. The dog pushed himself up, his legs trembling beneath his weight, and took a step toward Ryan, then another. Ryan barely dared to breathe. Then, with a quiet whimper, Axel lowered his head and rested it against Ryan's knee. The touch was light, but it was everything. A choice. A silent confirmation of trust. Ryan knelt, his fingers threading through Axel's matted fur. The dog didn't pull away. His breathing was shaky, but his body had stopped trembling. Ryan felt his throat tighten. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "You remember me, don't you?" Axel let out a slow exhale, the closest thing to relief that Ryan had heard from him. Frank watched the moment unfold, his face unreadable. But then, after a long pause, he sighed, a deep, weary sound. Resignation, understanding, acceptance. Slowly, Frank reached down and untied the rope from Axel's neck. He coiled it around his hand, his movements slow, deliberate. Then, with one final glance at Axel, he stepped forward and placed the rope into Ryan's outstretched hand. Ryan stared at the frayed leash in his grip, the weight of it settling in his palm. It wasn't just a leash. It was a responsibility, a promise. Frank's voice was quiet when he spoke. "He was never really mine," he admitted. "I just kept him safe until you found him." Ryan looked up, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. Frank nodded once, then took a step back. "Take care of him," he said. Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at Axel, who was still pressed against him, his body weak, but his eyes more alert than they had been before. The fight wasn't over. Axel had a long way to go, but he wasn't alone anymore. Ryan gave the rope a gentle tug. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. And for the first time in a long time, Axel followed. The weight of the leash in Ryan's hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just a strip of fabric. It was a symbol of the failures of a system that had turned its back on the very creatures that had given everything for it. Axel wasn't just a single case of neglect. He was proof of something much larger, something darker. As Ryan drove home that night, Axel curled up in the passenger seat beside him, his breathing slow and even for the first time since their reunion. The dog was exhausted, but he was safe now. But what about the others? How many more like Axel had been cast aside, abandoned in alleys, left to starve because they were deemed no longer useful? That question gnawed at Ryan long into the night. He sat at his kitchen table, Axel resting on a blanket beside him, and started digging. He pulled up everything he could find on Sentinel Defense Group, their contracts, their financial records, their public statements. Everything seemed legitimate on the surface, but Ryan knew better. The way Axel's records had been erased, the way Marcus Doyle had spoken so casually about removing dogs from the system, this wasn't incompetence. This was a pattern. Ryan spent the next few days reaching out to anyone who might have answers. He called old contacts from his time in the military, fellow handlers who had also been forced to say goodbye to their K-9 partners. One by one, the stories started to pour in. A former Marine told him about Ghost, a Belgian Malinois who had served 3 tours in Iraq, only to be lost in transition when his unit came home. A retired police officer spoke of Coda, a bomb-sniffing dog who had been promised a family but was instead dumped in a shelter and euthanized when no one came for him. Another handler had tried to adopt his K-9 partner, Rex, only to be told that the dog had already been placed in a suitable home. Months later, Rex was found emaciated, chained behind a warehouse with no food or water. Ryan felt sick. Axel was not an isolated case. He was part of a much bigger betrayal, one that had stolen the futures of hundreds, maybe thousands, of K-9 heroes. Fueled by anger and determination, Ryan took action. He reached out to animal rights organizations, military advocacy groups, and journalists willing to listen. He gathered every document, every testimony, every painful story of these forgotten warriors. Then he went public. He started small, an online post detailing Axel's story, complete with pictures of how Ryan had found him, frail and near death. It spread faster than he had anticipated. Within hours, thousands of people had shared it. Within days, national news outlets were picking it up. The outrage was immediate. How could the government allow this to happen? How could a company like Sentinel Defense Group continue to operate unchecked? Ryan didn't stop there. He named names. He called out Sentinel Defense Group, exposing how they had systematically discarded retired K-9s, how they had manipulated records, how they had erased dogs from databases to avoid responsibility. He exposed Marcus Doyle for what he was, a businessman who saw heroes as disposable assets. The pressure mounted quickly. Activists demanded investigations. Veterans called for accountability. News stations ran segment after segment featuring former handlers, each telling similar, heartbreaking stories. And then, finally, the government took notice. A federal investigation was launched into Sentinel Defense Group. Subpoenas were issued. Documents were seized. The truth could no longer be buried. The findings were worse than even Ryan had imagined. Hundreds of K-9s had been removed from the system. Many had been dumped at shelters with no records of their past. Others had simply disappeared. At least 50 dogs had died due to neglect. The backlash was swift. Sentinel Defense Group was shut down. Marcus Doyle resigned under public pressure, his reputation in ruins. Laws were proposed to ensure that no military or police K-9 would ever be discarded like Axel again. But for Ryan, this was never about laws or corporate takedowns. It was about justice. One evening, as he watched Axel sleeping peacefully by his feet, Ryan realized something. He had set out to save one dog, but in the process, he had given hundreds of others a second chance. And that, he thought, was a battle worth fighting. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Ryan adjusted the collar around Axel's neck. The dog, though still lean from months of hardship, stood taller now, his coat healthier, his movements steadier. It had been weeks since Ryan had first found him in that park, and though the road to recovery had been long, Axel was no longer just surviving, he was living. Today was a day of recognition, not just for Axel, but for every K-9 who had served, sacrificed, and been forgotten. A new organization had been founded in response to the scandal Ryan had exposed, a sanctuary dedicated to ensuring that no retired K-9 would ever be discarded again. It was a hard-fought victory, but Ryan knew the fight was far from over. As they arrived at the event, the sight before him took his breath away. Hundreds of people had gathered in Veterans Memorial Park, standing shoulder to shoulder, handlers, soldiers, families, and dog lovers alike. The crowd stretched beyond the pavilion, where a towering bronze statue had been unveiled just moments ago. Ryan's eyes locked onto it, and his throat tightened. It was a sculpture of a K-9 in mid-stride, its head held high, eyes forward, as if ready to take on any mission. The details were painstakingly crafted, from the ripple of muscle beneath its coat to the insignia on its collar. And at the base, an inscription read, "To the loyal companions who served without question, protected without hesitation, and loved without limits. You will never be forgotten." Ryan swallowed hard. This wasn't just a statue. This was a promise. Beside him, Axel shifted slightly, his ears perked as he took in the scene. The dog had never been one for crowds, but Ryan could feel no tension in him now. It was as if he knew this moment belonged to him, and to all the others like him. A voice echoed over the speakers, pulling Ryan from his thoughts. "And now, A few words from the man who made all of this possible. Sergeant Ryan Carter. A ripple of applause followed as Ryan stepped onto the small stage, microphone in hand. He had faced enemy fire, survived ambushes, fought battles in war zones, but this moment felt heavier than all of them. He took a slow breath and looked out over the crowd. "When I found Axel, he was starving," he began. "Alone, forgotten, and the worst part, he wasn't the only one." A hush settled over the audience. "These dogs," Ryan continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "they don't ask for medals. They don't ask for recognition. All they want is to serve, to protect, to stand by our sides. And for years, they did just that. They gave us everything. And in return, many of them were abandoned." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. "I believed in the system," Ryan admitted. "I trusted that Axel had been given a good home. But trust isn't enough. We have to be better. We have to do better." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And today, we start." He gestured toward the statue behind him. "This monument isn't just for Axel. It's for every K-9 that has served. It's for every handler who fought to keep them. And it's a promise that never again will we allow our heroes to be forgotten." A swell of applause rose through the air. Ryan blinked against the sting in his eyes, then looked down at Axel, who sat patiently at his feet. Kneeling, Ryan reached out, resting a hand against the dog's fur. "We did it, buddy," he murmured, his voice just for Axel now. "No one will ever throw you away again." Axel looked up at him, his amber eyes shining with something Ryan hadn't seen in months: trust. Slowly, for the first time since they had been reunited, Axel's tail gave a small, steady wag. Ryan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a quiet chuckle escaping him. The past could not be changed. The dogs who had been lost could not be brought back. But here, in this moment, Axel was safe. And thanks to this new beginning, so many others would be too. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting golden light across the park, Ryan stood, giving Axel's leash a gentle tug. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "Let's go home." And as they walked together, side by side, beneath the fading sky, it was clear that this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The story of Ryan and Axel is more than just a tale of reunion. It is a testament to loyalty, sacrifice, and the duty we have to those who serve selflessly. It exposes a painful truth, that even the bravest can be forgotten when they are no longer deemed useful. But it also proves that justice is not just about righting a wrong, it is about ensuring that mistakes are never repeated. Axel's journey from hero to outcast, and ultimately to redemption, mirrors a lesson that applies far beyond the world of K-9 soldiers. How we treat those who have given everything for us, whether human or animal, defines who we are as a society. As the saying goes, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. These dogs, who have saved lives, detected dangers, and stood beside their handlers in the darkest moments, ask for nothing in return but care and respect. Ryan's determination to uncover the truth speaks to something deeper within all of us, the responsibility to stand up when others are silenced. He didn't just fight for Axel. He fought for every forgotten warrior, for every sacrifice that went unnoticed. In doing so, he reminded the world that no act of service should ever be repaid with abandonment. At its core, this story is about redemption, not just for Axel, but for a system that failed him. It is a reminder that true loyalty is not just given, it is protected. Because in the end, heroes never stop being heroes. It's up to us to remember them. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.